Okay, good afternoon to everybody. Welcome back to this session where we're going to focus on the long-term prospects of the Economic and Monetary Union reform. And I think it's exciting times to talk about Euro area reform. As we saw this morning, there is a sense of political momentum, a sense of urgency, even if the session was a bit sobering, for me at least. But here we're going to be in the world of the nice to have things. We're going to be on the realm of positive economics and not realpolitik. And we're going to be discussing how we view the EMU evolving. The panel up here at the stage with me is very well qualified to discuss. They are thinkers, policymakers, and advisors on EMU reforms. And they are deeply informed in understanding where we are now, where we will be in 18 months from now, and where we should be in the future. So let me start by introducing Grégory Clay, who is research fellow at Bruegel. He mainly focuses on international macroeconomics and finance, central banking, and European governance. Grégory has written extensively on Euro architecture and on ECB monetary policy. Then we have also Fernando Fernández. He's professor at Instituto de Empresa Business School. Fernando coordinates each year the publication of Anuario Euro, a leading publication in Spain on EMU. And this year it was particularly dedicated to the long-term prospects. A very nice reading that I recommend to all of you. And he's also one of the 21 economists and former politicians who recently published a paper on the future of EMU. Some of the other economists are here in the audience too. Next we have Olivier Garnier. He's Director General for Economics and International Relations of the Banque de France. He's also a member of the Banque de France Executive Committee, and he's longtime economic advisor to the French Prime Minister. Olivier has deep influence on the Euro debate and the French policy formulation. Next we have Johannes Lindner. Last but not least, he is head of the European Institution and Fora Division in the Directorate General European and International Relations at the ECB, long name. Johannes is also somebody who is deeply involved in the EMU debate, especially on the economic and political aspects for further Euro area integration. So in order to not duplicate the debate we had this morning, that was exciting and very interesting, but I wanted to frame the debate this afternoon in a different world, we could say. Let's all make this mental exercise. We can even do the yoga exercise and mental exercise and put ourselves in the future and say, what would happen if we had a wonderful European leaders summit in June? We have a complete banking union with a single resolution fund, with a lovely EDIS in place.
Wonderful for whom?
And maybe, I hope for all of us European. And then we also have an embryo of what could be a stabilization function. So we're in the positive world. And we think we are in the world of, as French would say, tout est pour le mieux dans les meilleurs des mondes possibles. So we're sitting there very comfortable, but we still think that in the next crisis, we wonder if we are still well equipped to make sure that the Euro area gives us the financial stability that we all aspire to have. So in this, we start to wonder if we have the Euro area governance that we need with a stronger democratic accountability. We also wonder if we have achieved a stronger fiscal union with simplified and improved fiscal rules and with better discipline from member states and greater ownership, with a central fiscal stabilization function that can ensure the adequate aggregate Euro area stance. And we also have a stronger, we also want a stronger financial union with a truly integrated financial markets. And there maybe we need to still work on the bank sovereign nexus, and to that end we might need a European safe asset and revisiting the regulatory treatment of sovereign exposure. And we also want a stronger economic union with a greater attention to competitiveness and to convergence. So in this world, let's start the debate. Grégory, I would like to start with a question to you. There is a lot of discussion on the need of a common capacity function in the Euro area to provide public risk sharing, as we saw this morning. Macron has expansive plans for a Eurozone budget, but we also heard this morning the IMF talk about proposing a rainy day fund. And we heard last week Mario Draghi say, and I'm quoting, the Euro area needs a fiscal instrument to maintain convergence during large shocks without having to overburden monetary policy, an extra layer of stabilization. So, the Commission has proposed a European stabilization investment function recently on the form of back-to-back loans provided under the EU budget. And you have yourself argued in the past for a European unemployment insurance scheme. So I was wondering if you could explain to us why do you think it's needed, this central fiscal capacity, and what forms would it take? Your floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for the nice presentation, nice introduction. Thanks also for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here in Madrid to discuss this important topic of the future of the Eurozone. Let me start directly with some advertisement for myself. So the presentation that I'm going to make and the initial remarks I'm going to do are based on the papers that I have written last year for Bruegel. It's called The Missing Pieces of the Euro Architecture. And I encourage you to download it on our website. It's free. And to read it, because I won't have time to explain it all. So you can look into the details in the paper. So, but basically, to summarize very quickly that paper, what I explain in that paper is that even though we have had major institutional innovation introduced during the crisis, and even though I think the architecture has been greatly improved, as it was mentioned this morning, the monetary union is still incomplete. So we have created a banking union, an ESM, OMT, SRB, the macro imbalance procedure, we have changed the fiscal rules, etc. So we have done a lot, in fact, during the crisis, and especially, at the end of the crisis towards 2012. But in my view, this architecture is still imperfect and will not be able to prevent the rise of new imbalances and to manage crisis well in the future. So what I think is that first we need a coherent package of reforms. First, we need to complete the banking union, as it was mentioned this morning, with EDIS and SFR backstop. We also need to reform the ESM. We also need, in my view, to reform the fiscal rules. We need to rethink the macro imbalance procedure. And all of this need to form a coherent package, as I was saying, and I hope we will get that package, hopefully, in the short run. But, however, so you can read all of this in my paper, but however, today, our moderator asked me to focus on one particular element of this package that is maybe more for the long run, so that's why I focus on that in this session this afternoon, that is more about the long run and the nice to have, as you said, which is the need for the Eurozone to have a stabilization tool to provide sufficient stabilization for large shock. So first, why would we need such a stabilization tool in the euro area? In fact, the first argument are the classical argument of an optimal currency area, that basically, if you enter a monetary union, if you're part of a monetary union, you lose some major stabilization tool, of course, because you have no exchange rate with your main trade partners, which are in the monetary union. You have no autonomous monetary policy in case your business cycle diverges with the one of your partners. And also, contrarily to a monetary union like the US, you have no other adjustment mechanism to rely on, because we don't have significant federal transfers, apart from the EU budget that is quite small and not counter-cyclical. We have a very low mobility of workers, and we have a limited capital integration, even though we are working on this. But all of this will take a lot of time, and in the meantime, we need something else as a stabilization tool. So that's why, in fact, I think we need a more active role for fiscal policy in the Eurozone in order to compensate those missing adjustment channels that, for example, the US have. And I think that fiscal policy will have to play a bigger role first at the national level. And I think it is clear that at the national level, the fiscal policy needs to be more counter-cyclical, needs to be more counter-cyclical in good times. I think we need to build a big margin for maneuver in good times, and I think that's very important. And also, it needs to be more counter-cyclical in bad times, and I think fiscal policy needs to support growth better also in bad times. So in order to do that, I think we should reform the fiscal rules. However, I don't think that fiscal policy at the national level is always enough. I think that there are some large shocks with which member states cannot cope on their own. And because those shocks are so large that they would increase so much the public debt of that country if fiscal policy really bears the weight of stabilization, that sustainability of the debt could be questioned at a later stage. So I think that we need to avoid that, and we need to find a way to do that. The other reason why I think we need a European euro area stabilization tool is because we need an instrument to reach the adequate aggregate fiscal stance at the Eurozone level and the right policy mix with the ECB. Those are very important, and I think a stabilization tool would help. Of course, coordination of fiscal policy between countries could also be useful in theory, but in practice, what the crisis has shown is that it's impossible to coordinate well, because it's impossible to convince other countries to do the fiscal policy that they don't want to do, especially if this fiscal policy is too tight. So basically, I think that to solve those two big issues, we need a stabilization tool at the euro area level. And so if we want to build a euro area stabilization tool, what characteristics should this tool have? I see different type of characteristic. I think it should be both economically relevant but also politically acceptable to all member states, and that's why I have these 6 characteristics that I think a Eurozone stabilization tool should fulfill. And for the economically relevant one, I think they are quite straightforward. The first one, of course, is that such a tool should provide cross-country risk sharing, because I think that loans are nice, but they are not enough, especially given what I just said before about the fact that if you endebt yourself a lot, when you face a large shock, then your sustainability would be questioned. The second thing that we need to, that this tool should have is it should be of sufficient magnitude to reach the right fiscal stance in combination with national fiscal policy, but also with ECB. Third, it should have a borrowing capacity for intertemporal risk sharing, because I also think that, for instance, rainy day funds, as the one that was mentioned this morning, could be useful, but in my view, they are not optimal, because anyway, if you build a rainy day fund, it will have a limited amount built in, and this amount could be either too small if you have a really large shock, or it could be useless if you don't have a shock at all, and therefore it's a bit inefficient to build such a rainy day fund when you can in fact borrow on the market when you need it. The fourth element is that I think that a stabilization tool should be quite automatic and release quickly, because I think that the crisis showed that when you wait for too much time, then the situation can deteriorate quite quickly. And finally, to be politically acceptable to all member states, I think that such a tool should have the 2 next properties. The first one is that it shouldn't lead to an incentive to reduce fiscal discipline or to neglect structural problems. And finally, it shouldn't lead to permanent or at least persistent redistribution between member states. So given that now we have these 6 characteristics that I think a good stabilization tool should fulfill, let's take a look at different options. And I'm going to focus, there are millions of options out there, millions of economists have made their own proposal. I'm going to focus on 2 of them. The first one, because it's the most recent, is the Commission European Investment Stabilization Function that you just mentioned in your introduction. I don't know why, but I think at the Commission there is someone that really likes those 4 letters, because we have ESIF, FC, and now we have EISF. So I'm waiting for CEF or something like this. Well, anyway, so I'm going to discuss this proposal by the Commission, and then I'm going to also discuss my own proposal, which is a European catastrophic unemployment insurance scheme that you also mentioned. Basically, what would it look like, this EISF? Basically, the European Commission, in its MFF plan for 2021 to 2027, that was published on May 2nd, it has proposed a stabilization tool for the monetary union that will be inside the EU budget, and as you said, it will take the form of back-to-back loans from the EU to member states that would face a large shock. Does that proposal fulfill my 6 requirement? I will tell you why I don't think that's the case, but let's look first at so basically I put some red cross where it doesn't fulfill the requirement, and some nice green tick where it fulfills them. So let's start with the ones that it fulfills. I think what's good in the Commission proposal is that it's supposed to be automatic, and also that it fulfills the political requirements, so no bad incentive and no redistribution between member states. Where it doesn't fare really well, in my view, is that if you look at the other three elements, first, there is an insignificant level of resharing. There is no resharing, basically. It's just loans that are made to member states, and the only tiny resharing comes from the fact that the EU would subsidize the interest rate on those loans, taking some money from the ECB. First, we have to see if the ECB will accept this kind of proposal. But anyway, it will be very tiny because it will be 600 million per year. And if you compare that, for example, with the rise in interest payment in Spain in 2011, it increased by 6 billion. So it's 1/10 of this. So it would be a very, very small, tiny amount of risk sharing. The second thing is on the side itself of the lending facility. It would be, in my view, too small. It would be 30 billion. And if you compare it, for instance, to the Irish loans that were made during the crisis, it would represent only 1/3 of the Irish loans. So it wouldn't help even a small country like Ireland, even though I know the Irish situation was special, but it wouldn't be enough to help a country like Ireland, and it wouldn't be able to offer help to multiple countries at the same time. So I think that's a problem. And in fact, this is related, in fact, to the limited borrowing capacity of the EU budget. And basically, we already encountered that problem during the crisis when the Commission created the EFSM. And basically, the EFSM was not useful for one reason, is that the EU cannot borrow enough to lend massively to countries, and therefore the EFSM had to be replaced by the ESM later. So I think that the EISF, basically very similar to the EFSM. The only difference is that basically it will be automatic. So that's an improvement. But in the end, I see little value in replacing the EFSM with the EISF. Sorry about the misspelling of the new proposal. If in the end they have the same problem, which is, in my view, the limited resources that they share. I don't know how much time do I have, but...
Tom?
A bit of time, yes. So let me, if I have a bit of time, just talk quickly about my own proposal, which I think is more promising, which is logical because it's my own. So my own proposal would be to put in place a European catastrophic unemployment insurance scheme. And basically, this would be a fund that would be activated only when a member state sees a huge increase in its unemployment rate, and that increases quickly. And this will be activated when the unemployment rises above a certain level, above the average of the last few years. So if it increases quickly, it's activated. If it increases slowly, or if it stays the same at a high level, it's not activated. And basically, this fund would provide unemployment benefits to the new unemployed, to those new people that have gone out of that have lost their job recently. And it would be financed by borrowing that would be reimbursed later with a contribution on the wages of all EU, all monetary union workers. And I think this would at least fulfill all the requirements that I have discussed before. Of course, the risk sharing is by definition. The borrowing capacity is also by definition because I put that in my proposal. But I also want to say that I think the simulations that I have made in the paper shows that this kind of tool would be able to absorb large shock in some member states of the monetary union. For instance, if we have had this kind of tool during the crisis, a country like Spain, for instance, that I've seen its unemployment rate go from 8% to 25% in only a few years, would have received a lot of money from that fund. On average, 2% of its GDP during 5 years from 2008 to 2013, and it would have helped a lot Spain, and maybe they would not have fallen into this bad equilibrium where the financial market at some point questions the sustainability of Spanish public finances. So I think that would help a lot. The other thing is that this would be automatic, and this would also have the advantage of being based on a variable that is really well harmonized in Europe. It's also quite well measured, and it's well measured and observable, which is not the case, for instance, for proposals that are based on the output gap, because we have no clue where the output gap is in real time. So it would be automatic. It will also not lead to bad incentive, in my view, because it will be based, as I said, on the change in unemployment and not on the level. So countries that have had long-term unemployment that is quite high for a long time, like France or Italy, they would not receive anything. In fact, my simulation shows that the countries that would not have benefited a lot from this would be France and Italy. And in terms of redistribution, in fact, I also wanted to say that, yeah, first, the parameters that I have chosen in my simulation, for instance, shows that this will not be so persistent. So Spain will be an example where the country would have been a net recipient for 5 years, but this is a particular example. But there are other countries that would have received money for 2-3 years. And in fact, if you look at it, it's not only, Spain would not be a special case, because if I started the simulation in the year 2000, and basically a lot of countries would have received from the fund. Germany would have received from the fund between 2003 and 2005, the Netherlands in 2006, Austria, Greece, Cyprus, the Baltics. So a lot of different countries would have received from the fund. So I don't think it would be a fund that would be reserved to southern countries. And if I can just conclude, because I think I already took a lot of time, I think basically what I wanted to say is that I think the basic building blocks have been introduced with the ESM, OMT, banking union, etc. But I think the overall architecture is still fragile. And I think for a good functioning of the EMU, we need, as soon as possible, a package of reform to complete the banking union, to create a capital market union, to reform the ESM. And then, in the medium term, we need to introduce a small-scale stabilization tool like the one that I have proposed. And I think that in the end, this would be like a very small-scale tool. If you look at the simulation, in fact, the debt accumulated by this kind of tool would be quite small. And I think that with this kind of minimalistic approach, we don't need a grand design with a full political fiscal union, a transfer union, debt mutualization, or even synthetic safe assets that have been proposed recently by the ESRB and that are supported by the Commission. So I stop here. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Gregory.
Thank you.
Very interesting, and I think it could come back in the debate and certainly in the exchange with the audience later on. We're going to turn to the financial union. So Fernando, I would like to turn to you. In our dream world, the banking union is done, right? And the capital market union is well advanced. Yet, there will still be considerable bank sovereign nexus, the so-called euro area doom loop. And euro area banks still exhibit a significant home bias in their sovereign exposures. And there are not truly European banks inside in the landscape in Europe. So I was wondering, also we heard it from this recent Franco-German proposals where they recommend reviewing the regulatory treatment of sovereign exposure with the introduction of sovereign concentration charges. And they put it as part of a deal with EDIS in that case, in that proposal. I was wondering, what is your take on this, on the regulatory treatment of sovereign debt? And if so, what form should it take? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Beth, and thank you for the nice introduction at the beginning. I don't need to sell my book anymore because you've done a very good job for that. So I will concentrate on the basic question. What do I see when I dream of a monetary union? When I dream of a permanent monetary union. And since economists in general tend to be very, well, at least I am not very much creative, I look at what is around and what monetary unions have survived. So what I see basically is capital moving freely from places, cities, regions, member states, that tend to save to areas that tend to spend. There's not really denomination risk in the minds of any single economic agents. The real question, of course, is how to get there. How do we get to a situation where nobody in the euro area thinks again about the denomination risk? So that's, to me, the sort of the building block for any reform that we do in the short and medium term towards the end goal. I also see large banks that operate freely all over the union, moving capital and liquidity, and selling the same financial products across the whole area. I should talk about this morning in the previous section. Let's call that for short capital markets union, but including typically things that we now include under the banking union process. So a stable permanent monetary union will necessarily include EDIS, some sort of deposit insurance mechanism for the whole area, but it would also include difficult questions like same consumer protection rules for all clients or financial agents. If you want to sell mortgages across the area, well then a mortgage, the asset has to be the same thing, and therefore it has to be, consumer protection has to be the same. Otherwise, it would be hard to imagine to have, as somebody mentioned this morning, I think it was Fernando Navarrete who mentioned this morning, the need to have retail banking, not only wholesale banking. So we need also the same insolvency procedures across Europe, the same rules for seizing collaterals in case of non-performing loans, and so on and so forth. So this is a long, detailed, legalistic agenda that we need to clearly put in place. This is what we generally speak of capital markets union. It's a very long process in itself, but there are issues, there are elements of that are fundamental that we need to address soon. I also see a central bank that conducts monetary policy for the whole area with an area-wide risk-free asset. And obviously, I don't see that area-wide risk-free asset in the union today. So let's call it Eurobonds of some sort. We can call it Eurobills, Eurobonds, whatever you want to call it. And if we have Eurobonds, we need a Euro Treasury that issues that bond. A bond that is backed by the area taxpayer, which obviously means it has joint liability, and therefore implies by definition risk pooling. And I also don't see that in any of the Commission proposals. I also see, when I dream of a permanent monetary union, a fiscal interlocutor for the central bank so that there can be a meaningful dialogue between fiscal and monetary policy. You mentioned to some extent that in your proposal. You need a fiscal interlocutor for the ECB. A fiscal authority, then, that we would call for sure the Minister of Finance or Minister of Economic and Finance for the Euro. A fiscal authority that would then define and implement the fiscal stance, ensure fiscal discipline, and what's more important, will enforce the fiscal rules. We need an authority to enforce the fiscal rules. There is some element on, and this is probably the only nice comment I would make to some of the previous comments in the early morning session, but this is what I find lacking in many of the Commission proposals. Before we really talk, at the same time, pari passu, we talk about risk pooling, we need to really talk about how to enforce the fiscal rules, because this is part of what makes a lot of people in the euro area skeptical about further risk pooling. Okay, I also see a fiscal capacity that operates as a stabilizing factor to partially offset idiosyncratic regional shocks. Typically, it's not a special fund. It typically makes part of the federal budget. By definition, any budget of any significant stable monetary area has an element that is the stabilization capacity. When I used to study public finances, one of the basic purposes of any fiscal authority is to ensure fiscal stabilization. So we need to have a fiscal authority that not only enforces rules, we also need to have a budget that has a significant element of fiscal stabilization over them. I also see an agreed procedure on how to deal with what then will become some national sovereign credit events, what we now call sovereign debt of member states. Will member states be bailed out? If so, under what conditions? Let's call it we need a European Monetary Fund to provide financial aid to states in crisis, subject to macro and or financial stability, conditionality, sorry. And a mechanism which, by the way, may or may not contemplate orderly restructuring. I'm a little skeptical about orderly restructuring mechanisms, probably because I worked at the fund, at the IMF at the time. They were already talking about orderly restructuring mechanism for the world. Remember the proposal by, what was this, the deputy managing director at the time? Anyway, it was in the 90s with the Argentinian crisis. And ever since, Kruger, right, thank you. So yeah, ever since, I haven't been able to come up with anyone that has been able to really propose an orderly sovereign restructure mechanism. The structuring by definition are disorderly because they are basically infringing on property rights. And how do we distribute the cost? We can be as naive as we want, we can be as creative as we want, but we will talk about how to put some order in what is by definition a disorderly process. But we do need some sort of process to deal with the crisis. Now, if the decision were to be not to bail out the sovereigns, as it is in some monetary unions, then we need to cope with increasing inequality. We need to accept that there will be, as a result of the lack of a bailout mechanism, increasing inequality, and maybe we need then at least some sort of emergency relief. And that's where some proposal like the one that Gregory has just put up on the table will come up. This is like emergency relief measures, sort of a UN, United Nations organization for catastrophic events. I don't think this is what a monetary union is about, by the way, but we would need that at least. And obviously, if we have all this, we would need some sort of political institutions at the union level that would ensure legitimacy and democratic accountability. Now, this is what any monetary union that pretends to be permanent has. So I was very surprised when I heard this morning, and I've talked to Ludger already this, so he wouldn't be surprised now when I mention it, when I heard that we did not agree on the end state. Because if we do not agree on the end state, then we might as well think about how do we get out of this before it's too late. And this is what we also call exit strategies. You know, if we do not want to know, and we do not want to face what it takes to make a permanent monetary union, then we may not want to have a permanent monetary union. And since I don't think it's a very ideal situation, you know, your dream situation, or my dream situation, is not one in which any country will be subject to crisis of confidence, by the way, not always necessarily the same countries, or episodes of speculative attacks, or political or turmoil, and have very few instruments to deal with them, then maybe, I hope not, we may have to think about exit strategies. Because everything else will resemble a fixed exchange rate regime. And having spent a large part of my professional life dealing with the failure of a fixed rate regime, the currency board in Argentina, I certainly do not expect, and I do not desire, do not dream that for the European Monetary Union. It is not an experience anybody that has anything to do, has had anything to do with that wants to repeat. Now, some of the proposals that I've seen on the table are just financial engineering. And let me quote somebody that most of you know, and hopefully all of you respect, Paul de Groof. He's written recently in a blog in Vox EU, and I quote literally, we have known for some time that financial markets almost never impose the right amount of discipline. In booms, they are exuberant and condone any excess. And in crisis, they become vigilantes and enforce unnecessary hardship. No amount of financial engineer will do the trick. No amount, I add, no amount of financial engineer will solve a real problem. Finance markets, by the way, may not remain this indulgent for very much longer. The ECB cannot continue to act alone, adopting policies that go beyond its responsibilities, mind you, by sheer necessities, not by desire. But the ECB is adopting increasing political decisions, which are, let's quote it, let's say it mildly, making their life a little more miserable every day. But I'm confident. Now, why am I confident that the Union may send finally a clear message of where it wants to go, and what is the end message? Because as it was remarked this morning also, we have moved a long way. We have gone a long way from where we were. Let me quote an important German politician in 2011, when we were discussing these things in the Minister of Finance of the Bundesrepublik in a seminar, and everything was very nice and smooth, and everybody agreed, and we all were Europeans, until at some point they said, well, why don't we talk about banking union? Why don't we talk about having a single supervisor for all banks, or a single resolution fund? And then this person, whose name will remain unknown to all of you, stood up and said, I will dedicate the rest of my life to making sure that banking union will not happen. Well, it has happened. It has happened 3/4 of the way. So I am confident that now we will make it happen the last quarter, because otherwise we wasted our time. You know, we have gone 3/4 to end up as we started. Now, I do know that some recent developments in Italy do not create the right momentum for significant advances in completing the union. I am a little old, but not that naive. And I know that this is complicating any talk about further risk pooling, but I also know that the only way to move beyond that risk is to move further pari passu with risk reduction and risk sharing, with fiscal discipline and risk sharing in the financial sector. And as we do that, we will repeat this crisis, these episodes, on and on again. Because as somebody mentioned to me over lunch, there is an element of no taxation without representation with which the current monetary union cannot go on much further. Now, having said this, let me talk about the two specific points, very brief, because they follow naturally. You asked me to talk about the European risk-free asset, or the SBBS, the sovereign bond bank securities. Well, this is short. It is obvious that the monetary union needs a risk-free asset. It is obvious that SBBS is by no means, by any stretch of the imagination, a risk-free asset. We can talk about this as long as we want, But if we really want to talk about risk-free asset, we need to talk about the Eurobonds, the Euro Treasury, and then we need to talk about how to service the debt. Will it be through a new tax, through sharing taxes? What will the proceeds of that bond be used for? But certainly, talking about SBBS, they are essentially a CDO. They are a collateralized debt obligation, a pool of sovereign bonds of member states without explicitly any joint liability or any form of combined risk pooling. And in that sense, they will not do the trick. The problem is, we already know what happened to CDOs in the private sector in the financial crisis. Somebody that you probably have heard of, Warren Buffett, has called them a weapon of mass destruction. The additional problem with these CDOs, with the SBBS, is that it shows even less risk diversification, because we're talking about building a CDO with only 19 really assets, really 19 European bonds for 19 member states. So the risk diversification is very limited. The high concentration of risk is a problem. Plus, there's high correlation in the risk. As we have seen in the crisis, all risks become even very good or very bad in times of crisis. And that's what happened in the previous episode of a capital drought that some countries it is happening. I wasn't talking about yesterday. I was talking about the 2010, 2014, 2012 episode. I was trying to be a little more polite than that. But anyway, so it is obvious to me that this will not do the trick. It's not safe asset. It's not substitute for safe haven bonds in banks' portfolios. By the way, as we already know, too, that these infamous rating agencies, like Standard & Poor's, has already advised us that asset will not be classified any better than in the lower investment grade, BBB minus, which is not what I guess a bank would want to have in the portfolios to substitute German bonds. It doesn't seem to be like the European Monetary Union aspires to have as a risk-free asset a BBB minus bond. So having been very blunt on this, let me also be very blunt on the second question, regulatory treatment of sovereign debt. Now, this has come up as a substitute for the former one. No? Since nobody's going to want these SBBs, how do we make it attractive? Well, then let's penalize any other sovereign bond. Let's make sure that banks do not want to have member state sovereign bonds on their balance sheets, and let's make sure that there is a huge demand for this newly created sovereign bond. Well, it's a little bit tricky because we may end up with banks only having German Bundesbank bonds in their portfolios, and then we will increase the exorbitant privilege under which the German taxpayer plays in the European Monetary Union. So what do I think of these two proposals for changing the regulatory treatment of sovereign debt, be it both of them, being concentration surcharges or, as I think it was you later mentioned this morning, using the ECB, the single supervisory mechanism through the Pillar 2, increasing the capital requirements for banks that find that they have an excessive exposure to their own member states. Well, I basically think they will not work. I basically think, first of all, let me put the question differently. Do we know of any stable monetary jurisdiction that penalizes the holdings of its own sovereign bonds? As far as I know, no. I cannot think of any monetary union that penalizes their own banks for having their own risk-free asset in the portfolio. So what we are saying essentially is, within the current state of the monetary union, some sovereign bonds are not risk-free assets. We are officially saying, if we are penalizing banks for holding this balance sheet, these bonds in the balance sheet, that there is a risk of default, a regulated risk of default for sovereign bonds, for some sovereigns in the euro area. There's an old Spanish proverb that explains to this. Be mindful, be careful what you wish for, because you may get it. In short, I don't think any of these proposals, neither the SBBS nor the changement of the regulatory treatment of sovereign debt, in any way makes the Union any closer to the end state of what a permanent, stable monetary union is. And I think the sooner we drop them, the better. Thank you.
Thanks, Fernando. I think you were very clear in your statements, and it will generate some debate. Let's move on to Monsieur Garnier. Private and public absorption channels of economic shocks in the EMU are not sufficiently developed. We heard that this morning. Both channels are less developed than in other monetary unions, the US or other. And we could even say that the currently fragmented financial sector amplifies the shocks rather than mitigating them. The banking and capital market unions will enhance the capacity of private channels to absorb the shocks, but only over time. So I was wondering, Monsieur Garnier, could you maybe tell us how can we develop absorption channels in the Eurozone? How could we achieve a genuine financial union that can unlock the potential of private absorption channels? Thank you.
So thank you first to Banco de España for the invitation. So if I understand well, this afternoon we have to address, we have to give the long-term view and maybe to make a dream. And being a new central banker, you know, my dream would be that maybe in 10 years from now, central banking will become a kind of boring business. So it's kind of paradox, because maybe if I became a central banker coming from the private sector a few months ago, it's just because currently it's an exciting business. But you know, taking a kind of a broad view, not a personal view, I think this could be the objective, because clearly I think there is a broad agreement that currently monetary policy is overburdened. Everybody thinks that. And sometimes it's not fully consistent to say on the one hand, monetary policy is overburdened, and on the other hand, we have to keep the status quo. And so if we don't want monetary policy to continue to be the only game in town, that means that we have to find new ways to improve, you know, the way risk is shared within the monetary union, and not only through public mechanism, but also through private mechanism. And so I will just make in my introductory statement 3 remarks. First, I will start with the question of the financial union. And I prefer to speak about financial union as opposed to capital market union. And even at Banque de France, you know, Governor Villeroy is speaking about a financing union for investment and innovation. Why do I prefer to talk about financial union? Because, you know, in capital market union, there are 3 words: capital, market, and union. And I think at the beginning, at the genesis of capital market union, maybe there were the, you know, I would say it was not, the premise was that, you know, the focus was exclusively on markets as opposed to banks. And the idea was maybe to say that, you know, there is too much bank lending in the euro area, and you know, markets were, you know, underdeveloped, and markets has to become a substitute. I don't mean that it is wrong, but I think it's a wrong premise, because what is, in my view, more important is first, in this wording, union, because when you think in terms of stabilization, if you are in a closed economy, and that means that in a closed economy, financial markets per se will not provide stabilization, because normally they will be correlated also to to economic shocks. And what is important, the key feature of capital markets is to diversify your risks outside. And this is allowed by capital markets. So what is important is not markets per se, but union in terms of, I would say, and that's why in terms of cross-border financing and also cross-border banks. I will get back to that. And the second part also is the word capital, thinking in terms of equity capital as opposed to debt. Because in this debate about, you know, bank lending as opposed to market debt, you know, we were focusing only on debt. And we know that there is already too much debt within the euro area, and what has to be developed is equity, and especially also in terms of risk-sharing property, because, again, I think there is a wrong way and a good way to implement a financial union. If you think at the early years of the euro area, there had been a lot of financial integration, but the problem was this financial integration was only through debt, be it cross-border, you know, interbank lending or, you know, bond markets. And of course, when you have, when financial integration is only through bond markets, then you have sudden stops. While, as opposed to when, you know, and it has been now well known, you know, if all the Greek banks had been owned by foreign banks, by German banks, for instance, then I think the impact of the crisis would have been much different. Take the example even in the Central Europe, where a large part of the banking sector is owned by foreign banks, and there had been also the Vienna Initiative. Then it has been, you know, it has helped to overcome the crisis. It was the same in the Baltic states. And that means that, you know, when we think about financial union, I think we need this very broad view instead of just talking about the technicalities and thinking about the ultimate goal, about just the technicalities in terms of markets or in terms of whatever. And again, if I can make a dream starting from in terms of banking union, you know, the dream would be that in 10 years, especially maybe just talking about for the bank supervised by the SSM, you no longer say that this is a Spanish bank or a French bank or a German bank, it is a European bank. And this, in that case, we will be able to say that, you know, that banking union is achieved, is completed, when we will be able to say that. And then, you know, all the debate that we have currently would be different when we say that. And it's about the same also in terms of equity markets. I think we need, this morning somebody was talking, even when we talk about equity market, that means also in terms of FDI, in terms of merging and acquisitions. The same for, at least for the large companies, you know, in that case, in the federation, you no longer, the equity capital should no longer branded as national. And this is the reason why we still, I would say, you know, one of the puzzle at the beginning of the euro, many people were saying, you know, current account imbalances will no longer matter. Look at the US. And the reason why it still matters is that, you know, companies and banks are still national, are still nationally owned in terms of, because there is not yet the state of, this dream is not yet achieved. So of course that means that we need, and we have, I will not get back to that, because this morning we discussed a lot about what has to be done to remove, for instance, the impediments to cross-border bankings, to cross-border consolidation. But I think this is very important, and we need this vision about what we want to achieve, and also putting the emphasis in the same way that if a Spanish bank is purchasing a French bank, it should not be seen as the problem, and it would be, I think it would be the sign that we are in the right direction, and then many problems also that we were discussing this morning also would be removed. And also what is important in this area, I would say a few words about also the saving markets, because again, when we talk about capital market union, very often, you know, we only talk about how to finance the euro area economy. And, but indeed, what we clearly have is a mismatch in terms of the asset side and the liability side. Because on the one hand, we know that European savers primarily demand, you know, fixed rate instruments and with a low risk, short-term instrument, very liquid, while at the same time we want to promote, you know, equity financing, long-term financing. And a good example, you know, if I take Germany, we know that, you know, the German people are savers. There is a German surplus in Germany, but at the same time, and I remember Mr. Schäuble once time said, we are very bad savers, because on the one hand, you see that the return on German saving is very low, because they invest primarily bank deposits, and now they complain about zero rate or even negative rates. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that there is no risk in their savings, and that's why the Germans are concerned, because you know, they are concerned about indirect risk through, for instance, target 2 balances. And so you could say that it would be, you could very much improve the risk return of these German saving surplus just by, if, for instance, if German savings was more invested in equity capital outside Germany, maybe the risk would be the same, but with a higher return. There is this possibility, and during the crisis, you could have also some adjustment mechanism in the same way. So we have also to, I think, there is not that much emphasis so far in how to maybe promote some kind of pan-European saving products in terms of, for instance, retirement savings. And I think we need to more imaginative in this area. It could help also to promote what I call the financing union. And just to finish, maybe a last remark about also, so far I've talked only on the private risk sharing, and I consider that private risk sharing is very important. But that doesn't mean that public risk sharing doesn't matter. And I think if you want private risk sharing to work well, then you need, some public backstop in some way, because we know that markets need sometimes some kind of backstops to work well. If not, we know that there is some panics. You were saying also that sometimes, markets are very pro-cyclical. They are not a good, I fully agree that markets are not good to enforce discipline because they are pro-cyclical. And if you want to prevent panics or bad equilibria, you need some backstop. That doesn't mean that sometimes, the mere fact and the magic, I would say, of public backstop, the mere fact that they do exist mean that you don't have to use them. But you need to be able to say that you have a bazooka, just not to be, it's like a nuclear weapon. But you need, indeed, you cannot say, I can rely only on private markets and on private risk sharing. So maybe I would just conclude. Maybe we'll have more time to discuss more in the details. But again, my dream is that monetary policy will become a boring business.
Thank you very much. We all hope that. And I'm sure we have a lot of things to debate on that afterwards. But let me give first the floor to Johannes. We have discussed for long this morning and now financial and fiscal aspects of the monetary union. And I would also like to turn more into the economic union and the governance of it. Wolfgang Munchau eloquently put it in a recent article, and I'm quoting, "If liberal democracy fails to deliver economic prosperity for a sufficient large portion of the population over a long period of time, it ends, not the democracy, the liberal democracy, and along with it, the financial and economic institutions it has created." So Johannes, how can we ensure that we have a cohesion, as we have in the title, in the euro area, and where do we stand on the economic part of the economic and monetary union?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I mean, for us, and I think maybe I can also speak to Olivier, who is not just wanting to be central bank to be a bit more boring. I have to say, there's another element which really makes me proud, is that when coming here to the Banco de España, you really have a bit of an element of seeing the family. And I think I have to say that when seeing here Eurosistema and the kind of close cooperation that we do here among us as central banks and within the ECB, I think is a nice example of where really close debate and close exchange among central bankers is working well, and this creates a climate where I think in a frank but very fruitful and constructive way we're exchanging arguments. And so I'm just very grateful and willing to come here, because I think it's a very important debate. Now, it's of course a very political debate, which makes it very difficult for us as central banker to take a stance. And also, I think what we can do is to give advice, but essentially it's a debate that has to be done by politicians, and where we can underline mainly that it's important to come up with solutions that are sustainable and not to dodge the debate. And I think that's something that we've been repeatedly now mentioned. the current economic climate should not lead us to dodging this debate and being sort of complacent. And I think for the issue of economic union, there are two elements, and in my few remarks, these two elements will be coming up time and again. It's the national level and the European level. So it's the key question of what is the European level's role within the realm of economic union, but there is a clear element of responsibility for national politicians and national governments for addressing key economic issues, for pursuing structural reforms. So when I say complacency, then it's also a complacency maybe to pursue these necessary reforms, and the one debate is linked to the other. So what can Europe do, and what is the stable architecture of Europe? But it shouldn't divert the attention to also the important tasks that national politicians face in coming out a period of a crisis. Now, the 2 points I want to nevertheless make in my talk is, one is, I think it's very, very important to see economic union as part of a holistic four-union approach. And I think in that, this 4 or 5 presidents report was very important. There are clear links between financial union and economic union, the financing side and the real economy. We touched upon it briefly. There are clear links between calling for more fiscal union and needing to also address how you have structural reforms that provide the flexibility of having vibrant, innovative economic economy. So there are clear links between the economic and the fiscal and the financial union, and it's interesting that in a way the economic union has been a bit the stepchild of much of the debate on institutional innovations. There's also a clear link to the political union, and that I will be covering briefly as well. And the political union in the sense of what is this? I mean, and I think the key two terms here is ownership and legitimacy. So what is the institutional setup in a way to generate the legitimacy and to get the incentives right in the realm of economic policy making? I mean, the title of social cohesion is of course much broader. I mean, I will talk a bit about structural reforms and convergence, but I think social cohesion is something that, on the one hand, I think Europe needs to deliver, in the sense that I think it's an inherent problem of Europe, promise of Europe, but at the same time it relates to something much broader, which is more generally what political integration in Europe is delivering, not just in a kind of narrow economic sense, but in a more broader sense. But maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. Now, quickly on the kind of issue of economic union, I think it's really interesting to what extent really this economic union has, as I said, become as kind of a stepchild. So if you read the 14th Economist paper, there's zero mentioning of structural reforms and economic union, as if that is either taken for granted or seen as cumbersome and to be left out. And also, I mean, if you see what has been picked up from the discussion of the 5 Presidents' report, we still have a very cumbersome debate on national productivity boards. Also, the coverage that we have of the macro imbalances procedure is rather low. So in that respect, it's almost an intellectual challenge to say, okay, why is on this economic union, this debate on how to further improve the economic architecture is not progressing further. I think it's important to look at the centrality of structural reform and the interplay in a way between structural reform and convergence, and there maybe just to distinguish between the 3 aspects of convergence. Here, I mean, of course, the nominal convergence and the convergence of cyclical business cycle and financial cycle. These are 2 elements that are particularly relevant for monetary union, for a well-working monetary union. And in the recent time, in the sort of last 2 years, we've seen clearly some further reduction of divergence. So in that sense, I mean, there is some good news in the sense that the cyclical convergence has taken place, which facilitates the job of monetary policy, and also there has been a further increase of nominal convergence. At the same time, some of the sort of amplitude of the cyclical divergence, or the amplitude of the cyclical swings is still, there is still a divergence around that amplitude. So while the cycles are more synchronized, the amplitude, and that very much relates to the resilience. So the ability of economies to, when they hit a shock, to buffer that shock and not to be hit by the shock and taking a longer effort to, in a way, come out of it. Then there is, of course, the other aspect that is real convergence. And real convergence may be a bit less pressing for a monetary union, but at the same time, I think it is important that we still don't lose out the perspective of real convergence. One of that is the elements of social cohesion, which you have here in the title, which is a bit this promise of Europe to in a way, deliver social cohesion. And it's the question of how that can be achieved and who is responsible for that. But there's also of course, the interplay between risk sharing and real convergence. I mean, real convergence is necessary in order to have, in a way, the trust that the risk sharing that you would want to go into, and which has been required, would not lead to permanent transfers. So in a way, the real convergence is an element that is also facilitating further risk sharing. Now, if you now look a bit into what are the instruments at play, and what is clear is that originally, by keeping within economic and monetary union the E small rather than the capital M, in the kind of language that Jean-Claude Trichet used to say. So in a centralized monetary policy, or in a union where the monetary policy was centralized, there was this notion that economic policy making could be left very much at the national level. I think, except of course the single market, the notion that the single market would do the kind of necessary convergence, but you could leave the economic policy mainly at the national level. But this kind of endogeneity of convergence, that it would come automatically through monetary union itself, of course we have learned in a way the lesson that that is not happening, and that's where in particular the build-up of imbalances was responded to in the crisis through the creation of new instruments, in particular the macro imbalances procedure. Now, if we look at the macro imbalances procedure and the innovation that was made by introducing that, I think it is relatively good in identifying the right prescriptions. So it identifies time and again in the CSRs, product market, labor market. Increasingly now, recently, I think we've had a stronger focus on framework conditions. The quality of institution has been emphasized also to our own work we've done at the ECB. But it's much more difficult to, in a way, translate that identification of what are the kind of the structural reforms that need to be done into implementation. So the record of implementation and the full use of the MIP is rather low and unsatisfactory. And so, I mean, you could argue, of course, one of the elements why it is more difficult in the realm of economic union than fiscal union is that you don't have that kind of clear benchmarks like 3%, 60%. It's much more the logic of individual policy realm. I mean, speaking of childcare or so, they have their own policy logics. It's much more kind of idiosyncratic to the individual country. It's kind of the specific history of a country that maybe is a bit more relevant in this kind of realm of structural reforms. But still, the implementation record is rather low. And I think now, I mean, you said that we were supposed to kind of look a bit more medium to long term. If one would now think a bit more freely, what could one address? What would be the instruments in sort of addressing this, the issue of why the current instruments not yielding the results that we want? I think there are two paths, in a way, one could pursue. One would be the path of really sort of using a kind of a combination between binding prescriptions from the center and harmonization, which would mean kind of a single market approach. So a little bit what we did in banking union by saying a certain policy field like banking supervision and the regulations around it single rule book, and a single institution is integrated. So you would go the kind of integration in subparts of the economic policy making. Of course, the key challenge of that is the subsidiarity principle and the divergence and the differences that many of the kind of economies and economic policy making in the different member states has. But that's kind of the notion of saying, okay, could we kind of be bold, and especially if we look more medium term, integrate further parts of economic policy making, more using the single market or extending the powers maybe even in directions like labor markets. Another element which would kind of respect, but still in that realm of binding prescription from the center, would be sort of country-specific, so respecting the specificity of a country, binding prescriptions, binding benchmarks, or even binding standards, which would then, as I say, be specific to a country, but it would be binding for a country. Now, this is sort of the realm of further integration. Another realm, it's to recognize that this is essentially a national competence. And and that's where, I mean, some of the newer elements of the Commission comes in. So either the defining it, which is using the corrective arm of the MIP, which we haven't done, really saying, okay, we really take seriously what we've introduced. Or, as I say, the more newer development that you find in the Commission is positive incentives. You say it's essentially something that belongs to the realm of national member states, so we incentivize. You want to do this reform, you get help. Or you want to do this reform, you get technical assistance. And that's sort of a bit more voluntary, but it would be sort of helping the member state in taking this up. Another element is market discipline. You would then say, okay, it's in the national realm, but you try to, in a way, to have an incentive set by the market, that the market, in a way, puts the pressure on the member state to do this, and then you could think of how you could include, through transparency or so, to facilitate that discipline onto the member state. Now, maybe two last remarks before I close. Now, I think it brings us to the realm of political union. So I think both parts, either you keep it to the national realm or the European realm. Of course, what is important is what is the institutional framework around facilitating this. And I think the two terms for me very important are ownership and legitimacy. And ownership, I would say, goes both ways. It could be ownership from the national side, but it's also ownership at the European side. The current situation, what I find is, and here I'm really more in the kind of conceptual asking questions realm, is the current situation is I feel that there is an element of blurriness. So national governments have the tendency to say, Brussels is asking that for us, or we are constrained because of Brussels. And at the ground, citizens don't get a clear sense of who's responsible. So in a way, maybe one element, but I'm really asking the question, would be to delineate a little bit more clearly who's responsible for what, to say there's this clear realm of the national economic policy making where the accountability has to work for national institutions, where in a way voters need to know this is the national politician responsible for that, and that national politician should be incentivizing by the next electoral cycle to, in a way, do good policy. So there is a national ownership for these structural reforms because they're relevant for the national realm. And there is a legitimacy circle in a way that they know they need to be standing up in election for that. And then there is the question of whether there are other elements, and that brings us more in this spectrum of further integration, where we would then have kind of European ownership, where certain tasks within economic union would be clearly taken up at the European side, and where you could probably argue that these are elements where maybe better solutions could be found at the European level. But then you need to, of course, also have European institutions that not only provide the better outcome, so that's the output legitimacy, but also have the input legitimacy, so meaning that politicians and also voters feel the choice here is for certain European choices to be made. And in an ideal world, that debate, what belongs in which part, should take place in the run-up to the European elections, so ideally starting as of October. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Starting as of now. So maybe, I mean, it's been very interesting presentations covering the whole realm of fiscal, financial, economic and political union, but maybe I would like to pick up on this latest statement by Johannes, more on the political side. And I really think a lot of governments, national governments, blame often the EU, right, for whatever policies they have to make, which are not pleasant for the local voters, for the citizens, and then they always take credit for the good things that happen. And with this, there is a certain legitimacy that is lost of the European project, or the European vision. And so I thought it was very interesting to discuss this internal and external legitimacy. I was wondering if you had views on that, on more on the political side. Fernando, you point your finger.
Yeah, I actually wanted to make a quick comment on Johannes' question. He asked what I think was an interesting question, the way he phrased it. Why does the economic union receive so little attention? And then you relate it to two items, convergence and the MIP. And I think the answer is because, or my answer to this is because we're asking monetary union to do too much. I mean, there's no monetary union that has ever delivered nominal nor real convergence. You know, if you look along established monetary unions, they do not show a remarkable level of nominal or real convergence internally. So one of the things one of the reasons why I think there is a problem with legitimacy at the EU level and certainly in the union and monetary union is that we are asking the union to deliver the public goods that it cannot deliver. Mm-hmm. So maybe this speaks to this idea of not raising expectations that on other topics I found wrong. But I really do think that the more we talk about real convergence, the more we are defeating the whole idea of monetary union, because it will not deliver real convergence. It has never been delivered by any monetary union that I know of. Mm-hmm. So that's one point. And briefly on the 2 points you mentioned, but real convergence is about permanent transfers. I mean, real convergence, when you look at it, is about, well, maybe not permanent, but very long-term transfers. I mean, we in Spain have been dealing with real convergence among the different regions for many more years than I can remember reading about, not just living. And we still have a problem with real convergence, and we will have a problem with real convergence. So real convergence is about permanent transfer. Now, if we want to be serious about real convergence, then please stop talking about non-permanent transfers, or making sure that the union does not include permanent transfers. And the other point is, because when we talk about the MIP, we're really talking about the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is the surplus of the balance of payments of Germany. Okay? Just as the elephant in the room we're talking about free sharing is Italy, the elephant in the room we're talking about the MIP is Germany. And here I find a lot of sympathy for the German view, because to me the idea that we will penalize those best performing is not only preposterous, but it runs contradictory to the whole idea of the monetary union, because when I was running to meet the Maastricht criteria, the whole idea was try to be like the best performer. Inflation, interest rate, remember? It was about convergence to the best, not convergence to the medium. Now we are formulating the MIP as penalizing the best. Let's make sure that these guys do not export that much. Instead of bringing in incentives for the rest of the economies to export more or to import less, what we're trying is to penalize those who export more. So that is also typically counterproductive.
But if I may reply in my dominating position from here...
Moderators are not supposed to intervene.
But I'll take the liberty. So just say on this one, I mean, as the European Commission, we see it on the German side not only as having a big surplus, but as having lacking investment, on public investment. So we see it from the perspective that is good for the member state itself, not only for the euro area, to cater for that. But
that's a hard point to sell.
Well, that's what we've been selling for a few years.
Less,
but maybe, I don't know if Olivier or Grégory, do you want to come join in this?
No, on that point, I wanted to maybe discuss 2 issues with the divergence process. First, I think there is still something to do. You seem to think that, okay, in every monetary union and every single market, like for example the US, it's true that we have agglomeration effect. And in fact, it's true that Massachusetts and I don't know, Iowa have not converged. In fact, they have converged for a while, but now they're starting diverging again. And but the thing is that first, we can do 2 things in that case. First, you should try to avoid hysteresis effect. So when there is a crisis in a particular state or a particular member state, we should have a stabilization tool to avoid that the country goes to hell forever. Sure. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, in fact, we have, on that front, federal transfers for long-term convergence. We have the cohesion policy, and it has been quite effective in Eastern European countries and quite significant. So we have, in fact, the tool to address the long-term convergence problem. Maybe we need to spend more on this. That could be a solution.
Yeah, but that's the EU solution, not a EMU solution.
Yeah, but
so this
as far as I know,
Union
the EMU is still part of the EU.
But the point I'm making, I fully agree with you. I mean, I fully agree with you, Gregory. The point I was making is this is an issue for the European Union as a whole, but there is nothing that the European Monetary Union as such will do with convergence. So if we link the euro to real convergence, then we're, in my understanding, creating a problem for the euro.
I think we should at least avoid the hysteresis effects. That would be already a plus.
Sure, no, I fully agree with having a fiscal capacity, stabilization capacity. I said that from the beginning.
So maybe we could also take some questions from the audience. So we have this question here.
Thanks very much. Let me bring the other elephant in the room, Italy. It seems that very timely panel just ahead of the June meetings, but it seemed to me that also it was a lot about Italy anyway. Some fiscal issues were related to Italy, some banking sector issues, MPLs were related to Italy, and all of a sudden, the last few weeks, it seems the situation has escalated, and the situation, let's see whether we have a government in Italy, but it seems that the government is coming out with proposals that do not seem to gel very well with some of the advances that they were meant to do in this June meeting. So I know this is more about long-term issues, but maybe this becomes a near-term long-term issue. It's certainly been long-standing. So I guess the question is, it's kind of a free topic on Italy. So how do you see this playing unrelated to the issues that you're talking? Just bringing the theory back to a specific case of Italy. How do you see the situation resolving? Or if it doesn't resolve, and maybe I can pose you a specific question, which is, what if the situation gets worse? What if the Italian government continues with some of the fiscal proposals that do not seem to be in sync with the fiscal compact, with the Stability and Growth Pact? And what if they go ahead also with some of the banking sector, currency? How can you stop this sort of increasing crisis? I think the spread is, the Italian and 10-year space is approaching 190 to 200 basis points. Has been only over a couple of weeks. How do you see, if this, in the hypothetical scenario, that the government doesn't step back from these measures and carries on with these policies that seem to be at odds with the European spirit, what do you do? There is some contagion. It is happening, right? Unfortunately, it is happening. It is a reality. How do you handle the situation with the current tools if things get worse? But the topic is generally Italy, so feel free to comment on it.
Great. Maybe while you think about it, I'll just quote Martin Wolf yesterday, actually. He was reminding us of a report on the European Council of Foreign Relations, where he says, in no member state, barring Greece, did the sense of cohesion of individuals within the EU fall more sharply between 2007 and 2017 than in Italy. And in concrete, since 1997 to 2017, Italy GDP per head has increased 3%. So it's, after Greece is the country that has less increase its GDP per capita. And he was pointing to things that makes me think about Johan's note, the national level, the lack of economic reform agenda, and also the EU level, where he's, I'm quoting again, the EU has failed to achieve a target inflation or adequate demand, making it difficult to achieve post-crisis adjustments. So I think it's a very important question, a little bit the elephant in the room the whole day, and a very difficult one in a sense, but who would like to take it? Or maybe we can, yeah.
Okay, since I'm the only one who has no official responsibility. Well, you also
I
have
don't
no
have
official responsibility.
You are all exempt from your
So
official
I can understand this side of the table has some problem addressing the issue. Let me first of all, since you brought in, I think Martin Wolf's quoting, you know, the point he's making is basically coming from someone who thought from the beginning that it was a bad idea to have Italy in the Union, both for the Union and for Italy. So I'm not surprised that sort of stops the issue with Martin Wolf there. There are many people in Europe who still think that this famous one single monetary policy for all, one-size-fits-all policy doesn't work. And they will feel vindicated with Italy, which is fine. I mean, we knew that. They were already vindicated with Greece, and they would vindicate it with anyone that had a problem, so that's okay. The fact is that anybody who's been in a situation close to Italy, or worse than Italy, has found better at the end, with a lot of unnecessary suffering, to decide that it was better to be in the Union than outside the Union. It's, you know, Greece is a perfect example here. So that's what I think will happen in Italy, to give you my short answer to that. Now, will this be a painful process? Yes. Is there anything we could have done to have made it less painful? Yes. And there are two things that come to mind very clearly. One in the area, and both have to do with credibility of the rules. One has to do with the realm of banks, with the quality of the banks. And it probably has to do with, remember, there was at some point, there was a thing called AQR, the Asset Quality Review, which is very significant for many banks, certainly Spain. And a lot of, you know, a lot of implications that the AQR had for Spanish banks. Well, that didn't happen in other countries. It did not happen in Italy. To put it bluntly, Italy has done regulatory forbearance for too long, and at some point, it just happens that people get nervous. Okay, so that's one thing. So what could have we done? We could have tried to avoid regulatory forbearance, or to put it in current parlance, make sure that the national options and discretions are limited to a minimum. And in that sense, we would have reduced some of the elements of risk. Now, on the fiscal side also, we should have, from the beginning, made very clear, you know, in fact, we could have used a proposal that is already on the table, making the fiscal rule a very simple rule on expenditure and public debt. How we had a very simple fiscal rule. By the way, I do not work in this institution. I've never worked in this institution, but I think the Bank of Spain has proposed, actually, a fiscal rule which is an expenditure rule which is complemented in the level of intensity, to explain it easily, by the level of the debt. Now, had we had a rule along those lines in Italy, we would have probably not arrived to this situation. Now, will that have made the political situation in Italy any better? Who knows? This is an issue that will always stay with us. I mean, will the union be subject to, you know, somebody was mentioning this morning, wrong economic policy decisions. Well, is the union going to deal with idiosyncratic political decisions? Yes, that is part of the reason. Now, what do we have to have in place? A system that makes sure that if the country decides to pay by the rules, and if the rules are enforced, the country will receive any type of financial aid to make sure that any speculative attack will be dealt with. But if the country decides voluntarily, sovereignly, that does not want to meet the rules, then fine. But make sure that we avoid contagion. We make sure that those countries who do meet the rule have at their disposal all the financial and fiscal aid that is necessary to isolate the problem. Not the problem, the implications of the decision that the country has taken. Well, I don't think Spain and Portugal will need it.
Good.
But we do have in place the ESM. We do have in place the SRM. So we do have in place significant issues. And the only thing we have to do, let me be, I'm sorry, I'm taking too long. Again, very blunt here. Every time the union has had to go a little bit beyond the rules, it has done it. So why wouldn't it be different this time? Why wouldn't maybe create this fiscal backstop for the ESM or for the SRM, if need be, to avoid contagion from it? Let me stop.
No, I just wanted to add something about fiscal rules because it was mentioned by you and also this morning that fiscal rules need to be enforced. And I think what you just mentioned about the expenditure rule is also very important in the sense that, yes, I fully agree that fiscal rules need to be enforced, but I also think that the fiscal rules need to be good, and that's not the case at the moment. In fact, if you look at the structural deficit rule, which has been for a few years the main rule, in fact, at the Commission, the ones that were monitoring the most, in fact, it's a terrible rule. It's a good rule in practice. In theory, it's really good. It looks really fine because it takes into account the cycle. But in practice, it doesn't work because, as I was saying before, we have no clue where the output gap is. Therefore, we have no clue where the structural deficit is. In fact, I wrote a paper with a colleague of mine from Bruegel, Joel Darvash, where we basically show that the Commission had no idea where the structural deficit was. They were from one year to the next, they were revising their structural deficit by more than 0.5 percentage points, so more than what they asked country to do, and sometimes during the crisis by 2 percentage points. So they have no clue where they are. So we should get rid of that. If we really want the country to respect the rule, we need to get rid of that rule that is giving mistaken recommendation, and we need to focus on the expenditure rule that already exists, but is not really mentioned by the Commission. And that would be, in my view, something good if we want the fiscal rule to be respected, because country will never respect rules that are bad. And
wait.
No?
Okay.
Now, I just want to make a point on your second topic that you touched on, which is the contagion. I also think that contagion is the main problem. I don't know how to deal with the Italian problem, and I hope we will not have to deal with an Italian exit. But what I think we should deal with and handle with care is the contagion to countries like Spain and Portugal, because we have seen already yesterday and this morning that spreads were also going up in those countries. And I think for that, we almost have the tools ready, but not totally, because we have the OMT, and the OMT should be used for this kind of cases where countries that have good fundamentals and good policies should be helped by the ECB through the OMT. The problem of the OMT is that you need to apply to an ESM program. The problem of the ESM is that you need to apply an adjustment program that can be quite harsh on the country. So I think we need to add a third track to the ESM, where it's a pure liquidity track, where basically the ESM would just validate that the sustainability of the debt, that the debt is sustainable, for example, in Spain and Portugal, and then just allow the ECB to perform OMT. And I think that's absolutely necessary for this kind of cases where you can have contagion, because at the moment, a country like Spain and Portugal will hesitate before asking for an OMT program, because they know that they will have to go to the ESM and that they will have to sign a memorandum of understanding. So I think that's something that is absolutely necessary to add to our framework.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with that. That's a very good point. The point I was making before is that we are much better than we were in 2010.
I think so, but contagion can happen.
Yeah, no,
quickly.
sure, no, and also, let's face it, I mean, the ECB can indirectly do OMTs without applying OMT. So that's what I mentioned when I say, we do things that go a little beyond what the letter of the agreement does. But then, and it shouldn't be that way, but it's better than doing nothing. Okay, now I was glad you mentioned this point on the rules, fiscal rules. That's what I wanted to comment briefly also, because first of all, I'm very glad that you bring out this issue of the structural rule being wrong, because remember, I wrote and spoke aggressively against this when they were introduced, and I was the only one. People love structural rules. Economists would love structural rules. We thought we solved the problem. I always face that question. I mean, I still have to find two economists that agree on the size of the structural deficit. And I will probably die before I find two economists that agree on the size of the structural deficit or the size of the output gap. So I always said, keep it simple, sweetie. The KISS approach for fiscal rules is the best. Not only because technically it's the simplest, the best, but also because politically it's the only one that you can sell. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The one that people understand, the one that are very easy to see and they're subject to very little political discretion. This is it. 3 is 3, and you don't have to come out with a very complex 25 pages paper. Now, having said that, I fully disagree, not only technically, but also for political reasons that anybody living in Spain today would understand, about this idea that since rules are wrong, I do not play by the rules, and you change the rules. Now, the rules are there to stay until we change them through the channels that we have given ourselves to change the rules. Because if we are subject to apply the rules based on our personal or national, political or ethical interpretation of whether the rules are good, right, or wrong, then we have a problem. But not only an economic problem, we have a serious political problem.
Clearly.
So the rules are too much, even if we don't like them.
No, it's interesting, and we are in the whole debate now, reflecting on the fiscal rules, and we are already implementing in the preventive side of this HDP, all this expenditure benchmark, and anchoring debt. So I think we're moving in that direction slowly. But we have a question. You had a question from the first row.
Thank you. One comment and two questions, if I may. You stop me if I'm only allowed to have one. The comment is on the fiscal. I fully agree what you say, Fernando, and I think it shows the proximity of Spanish and German thinking. I mean, rules
I don't know
need
that
to
will
be
make me very
abided
popular
by.
here, though. You shouldn't say this, please.
But I understand all the points about structural deficits and so on. But I mean, to think that switching to expenditure targeting and debt targeting would make it easier is an illusion. And I mean, I'm speaking from the experiences of a Ministry of Finance that has to make budgets where the main steering instrument is the deficit, you know, and you have all kinds of ways to tamper with spending, and what has happened to the debt rule we all know. So I think we shouldn't just simply postulate simple solutions to a complicated question. My two questions are, the first one is on the very thoughtful remarks by Olivier on the risk sharing in banking union. How can we get to the point that we, so to speak, see bank ownership and bank presence less as a nationalistic issue? How can we get to less industrial policy-oriented supervision and bank positioning? I would personally not see a problem with the euro area banking center being Paris or Madrid. But I think that would be very unpopular. So how should we go about it? And the second question, if I may, is, you know, I mean, it's always very nice to talk about temporary transfers, and, you know, Germany in a way is a microcosm of the euro area. We have started with temporary transfers in many areas, and then they have become permanent, and then they haven't even led to the real convergence that, Fernando, you think seem to be coming from it. So, linking that with what Johannes, you have said, I think was also very thoughtful, you know, on defining who is responsible for what. And your remark on the incentives. Is there a chance that we have, so to speak, to incentivize or to link transfers with kind of conditionality that actually addresses problems that are underlying the real convergence? I mean, if you look at Italy, and I'm not talking about the finances, but I'm talking about the institutional framework. I'm very active on African countries. We always say it's the institutional framework that holds back real convergence. But to have conditionality linking transfers to improvements in the institutional framework, I see as very difficult. So I would be very interested to hear your views on that.
Good question. Olivier, do you want to take the first one?
On your question, Ludger, you know, I'm not sure that it would be so difficult to dream that banks, especially I'm talking about the large banks, could become European as opposed to national banks. You know, even those banks currently, you know, if you consider the large banks like BNP or Deutsche Bank, say, take the example of, I'm not sure that in Germany now Deutsche Bank is really considered as a German bank as opposed to the savings banks or to the, you know, the shareholders of these banks are already, I would say for these banks, I would say more than 50% of the market cap is held by foreigners. If the business of these banks is not only in wholesale banking, but also in retail banking, if you have a group like BNP, which is already in not only in France, but in Belgium, in Italy, and maybe in the future elsewhere, or a group like UniCredit, like Santander, you know, in that case, even from a political standpoint, as long as they maintain retail banking operations in the country, I'm not sure that politically it could be. Of course, it's still a dream, but it's not fully an unrealistic dream. I would reverse the question to you. Would it be a problem in Germany if Deutsche Bank was considered as a European bank as opposed to maybe as opposed to a pure German bank.
Would it?
Look at wait, they're bringing the microphone.
Leave the microphones out.
I think this question is how you do it. I mean, is important. You know, would we right now we are kind of Deutsche Bank. You know, if it moved headquarters to London or to Paris, I think it would be allowed. It would not be a problem. And that's I'm not sure that's true for all countries. But I think that's what should be possible. But you have a lot of protection of the local and regional banks, and you know, you have the direct and indirect protection. So I'm wondering, and we, you know, if we allow, let's say, resolution of banks that are in less good shape in one country, and then others from other countries would fill the gap. I mean, this kind of market-based adjustment process allowed by policies, I think the ECB will have a big responsibility in that through the framework that it sets. But I'm just wondering whether you'd have any ideas more concretely.
Even take the SSM, you know, if maybe 10 years ago you would have asked me whether or not the SSM would have been, you know, I would have, and in fact, there was no major problem to move the supervision from the national level to the SSM level, and even politically there was no major obstacle, and it has been very quick. It's in some way, with the benefit of hindsight, you know, it's rather a kind of you know, it appears as a kind of a very bold move, but it did happen, and. So I'm rather, on this side, I'm rather optimistic. Then you need, at the same time, you need to remove, that means that national governments also should be ready to accept that national banks could be purchased by foreign banks. And this has been, of course, as I said, maybe during the first stage of EMU, it has been a problem because each country wanted to have its national champions, and these countries going abroad, these banks going abroad to make acquisitions abroad, even when they had not the capital and to do that. And but I think I don't think it is fully unrealistic.
And Ludger, forgive me, but of course the completion of banking union, a backstop and EDIS would also help. So in that respect, of course, the more you fortify in a way a banking union where the member state and the nexus to the member state is not anymore so relevant, I think the more you also help a possibility that these banks are feeling more European. I mean, we had the discussion this morning already. Of course, there are other elements as well why mergers and acquisition may not take place. I mean, we had the waiver discussion or the ring fencing. There are also other elements like judicial procedures that are very specific in a country. So there's an information asymmetry in a way between a country, a bank in one country to a bank in another country, that they feel maybe reluctant to enter that market because they don't know the kind of judicial procedures. The harmonization of insolvency law in a way speaks to that. Also on the tax system, I think the context that we're discussing in the Capital Markets Union is also this consolidated tax base, where probably also it helps to harmonize some elements of where these sort of national and idiosyncratic knowledge that you need to have as a banker in one country to another loses some relevance. But if you don't mind, I reply to your interesting questions. On conditionality, I think indeed. I mean, that's something that we would need to look into a bit more. The Commission has some first proposals on that. I mean, I think one key element is the transparency on the reforms, the link to the European semester that would need to be done. Also, the question of if these reforms are not implemented, what happens then to the money? I mean, there are some further work I think that needs to be done in the discussion of looking how this is framed. Just two elements though of kind of caution or things we on top of that probably need to reflect further. It cannot work without ownership. I mean, your experience in Africa is probably exactly the same. is that you need to have the buy-in of the national government. So there needs to be a conviction that this is actually a useful and necessary structural reform, especially when you are in the realm of institutional quality. Takes time and is something, framework conditions, that where you need to really have the stakeholders wanting it and supporting it. And also, of course, in the MFF, and here, I mean, we will have the minister coming in a second, but of course, there is also a notion of, and one could see that critical, but that the kind of the EU budget, there is a certain cake logic. So the logic of, I mean, this is our part that belongs to us for other purposes like real convergence and other purposes like agricultural policies and so on. And now this is in a way, you see that they say, okay, this is something that where we are supposed to address certain functions like real convergence, and it's now connected with a conditionality that we don't see was originally assumed when the idea of such a cohesion policy was brought in. So to a certain extent, you can see already the argument in a way, why is this a kind of an additional conditionality that now is attached to these expenditures. And that's where the Commission comes in and says, let's have that as positive incentives. So in a way, additional incentives to further reforms. Ideally, that logic shouldn't, I mean, this should be coming both together, but you see that some of the pushbacks that we've seen on the notion of conditionality is this question of how big is the envelope? Is it just reducing the envelope, or are we talking about maybe additional money?
So if I can come in also with the head of the Commission official, I would add to that in the MFF proposal we have set aside, we're proposing 30 billion for a structural reform support program. And yes, it would be in the idea that there is certain structural reforms have a spillover effects in the rest of Europe, and it would be to incentivize, not to buy reforms, because there's no way you can buy reforms with that amount of money once you divide it, but at least to incentivize governments and get a little bit the support from the European Commission that we think this is a reform that needs to be done. It's under the umbrella of the European semester, and here you also have this financial support, and not only the technical support, which we are already giving in the structural reform support service, but also financial support. So I think it's more moving into the incentive kind of realm in economics more than punishing. But you might be wondering why we continue on speaking. I'll just say that the minister is a bit late, so I think we could just continue the debate. I know Fernando wants to say something. Gregory, you also wanted to say something, right?
Just on what you said about the...
Okay, so maybe first Gregory, and then Fernando.
No, just on the incentive, I think the idea behind it is really nice. But again, the 30 billion, what does it represent for a country like Italy? Of course, Malta might use it to implement reform, but do you think it's going to convince the Lega 5-star government just for 30 billion euros, even if you use all of the money in Italy? It's
well,
nice.
I think that's also when we come back to the point of Johannes, not always separating EU and national level. We are not going to finance structural reforms which should be done by national governments because they owe them and they think it's good for them. We're just going to support. So it's a financial incentive. It's a little support. Yeah. I would even say that maybe it's even more the political support you get from it than the financial support in a sense. But we're not trying to buy reforms. We're not trying to buy responsibility from national governments. This is their own business. We're just trying to support and incentivize what they have said as a reform agenda, and we had agreed with them.
Yeah, no, this issue of structural reforms is very significant and very important, and always extremely difficult. Mm. And we have to realize that, again, I know that the comparison is not exactly adequate, but it should be in our minds that the IMF and the World Bank have been dealing with the structural reform performance criteria for many years, and have come to the conclusion that they don't really know how to do it. They don't really know what to do with them, and they're withdrawing it from many of the adjustment programs. Why? Because they're very difficult to actually assess performance. Two, it's very difficult to withdraw a financial package based on meeting or not meeting a structural reform that may be seen as an imposition from the outside. And three, because some countries may find it marginal. Now, having said that, I do think this idea of incentives what makes the union very different from the IMF in this respect is that the union does indeed increase the political legitimacy of some of these reforms to some extent. And I like the point you mentioned, Pat. That's why, however, I disagree with this mention of ownership. Because the real problem is, if you're expecting the countries to have ownership of the structural reforms, they will never happen. Because the ownership, the country, if they had the ownership, they would have already done it many years ago. I mean, the only reason why structural reforms have not happened yet, the only reason why certain labor markets, or certain industrial markets, or product markets, or whatever, are far from perfect, is because there are very powerful political forces within the country, or very large political inertia that maintains and finds profitable to keep those institutions. So it will be very difficult to show ownership. So I think that we are overplaying this issue of ownership. It reads very well. It reads very democratic. You know, it gives us gives us a lot of confidence, a lot of well-being, because we're not imposing anything on countries. But if we insist on ownership, it won't happen. That's my experience in both as a structural reformer on the IMF, and second as a consultant trying to do political reform in Africa, where, you know, the bank at that case insisted dramatically on ownership, and then it was, you know.
Johannes,
Now,
you seem to be wanting to reply to that one.
Can I just make one point on what you said? Because, you know, I like very much your point about equity union, financial union. I thought that was, you know, a point that nobody mentioned. I think it was very, very,
very
good.
important.
And also this issue of cross-border banking and mergers and acquisitions. But let me say that, you know, we can talk as much as we want on this, but the actual fact is that, speaking from a country where some of its banks tried in the last 15 years to purchase significant banks in other EMU countries, both of them were rejected by their respective central bank. But face it, and we all know it, I don't have to give the names. So the fact is that, despite what we said, the facts as of today are that no foreign bank has been welcomed if you're buying a significant share of the banking market in any other European country, except, funny enough, in the UK.
Is that, sorry?
So it is a cultural change that we need.
But Johannes,
even in France, you know, a
Even
large
in
bank
France
was purchased by
it happened.
HSBC, bought Crédit Commercial de France. So even in France, it did happen.
Things are changing.
But it was 10 years or 15 years ago.
Yeah, but you know who else?
And
couldn't
now
buy?
with
You
the
know who else
SS,
couldn't
and
buy?
you know with the SSM, I think
No, that I agree. No, what I'm saying is
it's a key change compared to.
there's a lot of
Yeah.
there's an element of cultural change here. It's not only rules and regulations. It's
Johannes.
remember the moral suasion that central banks used to play? It's very important in reality.
Johannes wanted to come back to you. on
Just
something.
very quickly, although I don't know when the minister comes, because at some
Well,
point
when
I guess
he comes, we can round up. But
I don't
it's,
know,
he seems
I
to be
think we,
late.
I probably the marginal benefit of our
and quite late,
comments.
around 5:30 they say or so, so we have
No, but-
time.
No, but I think
Question. Let
okay.
them ask questions.
No, but I mean, I only have one little comment, and then maybe we need to do a break, but that's up to you. No, but I think the ownership, I think it doesn't go without ownership. And I think in my view, one of the key points is to get out of the program logic. And in a way, that's why I think the debate on economic union is so important, that you in a way, you are out of that kind of completely binary, so left alone, and then you're in a program. And while I have a lot of sympathy for distinguishing between the national and the European level more clearly, I still think you need to get a climate where the pressure on national politicians are so that there is a more positive momentum for structural reforms. And Europe
You're
can...
increasing the size of the structural funds already available. That's what you're doing.
Sorry?
You're increasing the size of the structural funds that are already available, which is fine. But you know, you're right. I mean, there are structural funds already there. So if there is not subject to a program,
No, but I'm not saying
there's
that...
no conditionality attached, then, you know, there are already structural funds for
Yeah, but,
countries that want to do things.
but that's the general question. I mean, I'm not saying that the positive incentive is the only way forward. I think there we do.
Just for the sake of
Yeah, sure.
lengthening the discussion.
Yeah.
So maybe we could take another couple of questions from the audience and then have a break. Yes, I see one there. Two. Let's take two of them at the same time. So raise your hand. Yeah.
Yours was a great wishful thinking list of how the European Monetary Union would look like and how it would go, right? But being pragmatic between where we are matters on how to get there. So the question is pretty simple. What single policy measure would you like to see in June, each one of you, right, coming out, right? Just one, right, that would give you hope that we're moving in the right direction. And what would actually worry you in the next meeting, right?
But,
okay,
if
so
something comes out, that'll be nice.
I didn't listen to the end of your sentence. What did you say?
Sorry?
What singles?
you want to have in June?
Yes, in June. But we're going to take another one, maybe, Javier, that you wanted to also.
Yeah, just quickly, one on the long run. I was wondering, I mean, we've seen all these debates and these points about one issue that has not been present in the discussion, and that was for example, in the Van Rompuy report or other reports, which is about the sequencing. No, I mean, what things can we do now, and what things are to be done in the future, but we need prerequisites. And part of the discussion about whether countries, I mean, need incentives or whatever, I mean, what shows is that maybe, I mean, for certain types of instruments, we are reaching the limits of the national state, of the traditional nation state. No, I mean, this goes a bit along the lines of the political union. So I think that maybe, I mean, this financial union maybe is feasible within the current boundaries, but I doubt, I mean, or I'm not sure, I mean, which of the other ones can be implemented without further moving into, call it economic convergence, or more political union, or rethinking the way the governance of the whole, I mean, this that now hinges on these nation states, and maybe we need a different framework. Thank you.
Okay. So the first one was addressed to all of you. Maybe we could just vote, and each one of you say what measure. And it's short term, so it's for June. You get to also say, have your views on the short term. Gregory, maybe we can do it this way. Yeah.
Very simple. I would say EDIS and SRF backstop to complete the banking union. Being pragmatic, yes, definitely, yeah. No, but if I can ask, I think changing the fiscal rules, even though I know it will not happen in June, I think would be on my wish list too.
Fernando.
EDIS and fiscal backstop to the ESM. And being pragmatic, unless we do it, we'll have a problem in this summer.
Okay.
So
Olivier.
If you want me to be pragmatic, I give you my word.
Being pragmatic, I think ESM backstop to a single resolution fund would be, I think, as Klaus Regling said this morning, it would show that there is still political momentum and commitment. And
Johannes.
Maybe because I don't think I can add much more to what has been already said. So maybe I take Javier's question on sequence and in a way the kind of more medium-term path. I mean, I think it's worth recalling a bit the notion that we had in the Five Presidents report. You mentioned as well the convergence process. So what it tried was to say, okay, let's come up with a sequence in a way of where certain, where rules are, a period where rules are implemented, really credibility and trust is regained, where also an incentive is there because the compliance with that, and a period of where convergence is further taking place. And I take your point that we're not aspiring to, as I also clarified in my talk, we're not aspiring to real convergence as a precondition for monetary union, but a rather defined way of where we would see in terms of outputs and so on further convergence necessary. And that would sort of allow you to combine this with the notion of having access to a fiscal capacity. So in a way that you combine that orientation, that objective, with a period of further convergence. And you can discuss that further, but that this notion of a convergence process or a kind of stepwise process is so lost, I find is unfortunate, because I think we should think a bit more of kind of where we would go and how do we get there. Instead, you feel that the debate is fragmenting much more into kind of national wish lists and national vetoes. And if we could get that a bit more together, and bring in, as I said before, this sort of more the holistic perspective, how the different unions are actually interconnected. I think that would be useful.
Yeah, precisely because I think that the sequencing issue may be a little misleading in the sense that it gives us another national wish list and how do we compromise. I wanted to bring in an issue that Klaus put on the table this morning in a very different context, which is treaty change. And I really think that we cannot move significantly forward in reconciling fiscal discipline, risk reduction, and risk sharing without the treaty change. And the sooner we start talking about the treaty change and the counter-treaty change, which will give us this pari passu movement in more, you want to put it in political words, solidarity and more discipline, the better. Otherwise, I find it I see it very difficult to change, to move significantly beyond some minor, marginal changes in the instruments that we had. And we have not, remember, we have not moved since November 2014.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we can maybe wrap up the debate here and thank our panelists who had a wonderful and very interesting, actually, insights on the EMU. I really enjoyed the equity union that we heard from Olivier and the importance of convergence and all your views, Johannes. Of course, Fernando, you were quite critical on the regulatory treatment of sovereign debt and SBBBS as European safe assets, and maybe there we could have had more debate, but I think also Grégory has to leave, and Grégory, you had good views on the fiscal capacity and a good proposal. So maybe we can wrap it up here, and please join me in thanking the panelists. The Minister of Economy is coming, so please stay around. We can just chat informally at the time he comes here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.